Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
On this episode, it's an absolute joy to welcome into the Taxpayers Alliance podcast studio, Elliot Keck from the TPA. Hello, Elliot.
Hello, Duncan.
And our guest on this week's A Nation of Taxpayers, well, a Fleet Street legend, broadcaster, journalist, the voice of common sense, Mike Graham, MG, welcome.
Mr. Barkes, nice to see you.
Thank you for coming in. Ton of stuff to talk about.
Yeah.
We'll get on to some of the political stories of the week in a few moments' time, with a little caveat there that anything can change, because things do change very quickly in our world of politics. But let's talk about you. I've known you for many, many years, knocking around various radio studios. But the one thing I've always loved about your broadcasting is you are the voice of the people, right? It's about it's what people in the pub are talking about.
Yes.
So when did you start to realise, either doing it on Talk Sport or Talk 107 in Edinburgh, which is a long time ago, that actually that's the kind of talk radio that people wanted to hear?
Do you know, I don't actually know the answers to that. I think it might be because I kind of learned about talk radio when I lived in America. I went to live in America when I was about 23. And I listened to a lot of music radio, but a lot of music radio was people like Howard Stern, as well as various different kind of, local radio voices. And it was a much bigger business, because to me, I'd sort of grown up listening to Radio 4, believe it or not. I'm so old, I think it was still called the Home Service at one point when I used to listen to it. And my mother used to listen to the Archers and the Today programme, and it was always on, Any Questions and all of that. So I'd sort of had this idea in my head of this very kind of, structured, polite sort of radio. Which was meant to be very sort of important and quite, quite respectful to everyone, because that's what it was like. And then I suddenly went to America and I was like, this is much more fun to actually be much more disrespectful to everybody, particularly anybody who was in authority. And so it kind of appealed to me. So I think maybe I was kind of imbued with it then. So when I got the opportunity to do it, on my own, as it were, in Edinburgh, in Scotland, I thought, well, this is what people probably should be hearing, because in Britain, at that time anyway, you didn't really hear much of it. No. TalkSport was very much a sports show, a sports station, and it was quite irreverent, and it was quite funny, and it was quite sort of cheeky. But there was no kind of news equivalent, really, of it. And I think, there was a gap. I guess I saw a gap in the market.
I find the whole talk radio phenomenon really interesting because in many ways it's kind of a precursor to social media right now. Nowadays, people are sort of moving away from certainly a lot of traditional media, and it's all about what you're doing on Twitter and you're having your own show. But actually, talk radio and various talk stations were very much a precursor to that. It was about moving away from this very stunted, structured way of discussing issues to it being a lot more kind of free-flowing and a lot more organic and a lot more dynamic, I think.
And listening to the people who are actually, listening to you, taking phone calls, Duncan knows about this, it really livens things up, because you're suddenly dealing with people who have got some pretty strong views. Some of them you might not like, you might not agree with, but they've got them. And when I did the overnight show, as again I think you've done as well, you had this really rich vein of people ringing in. Some of them were drunk, some of them were high, some of them were just conspiracy theorists. Some of them were both. Older people who were just not able to sleep. I mean, it was just it was an entire world, a new world to me, which sort of opened up. And I didn't know much about radio back then. I really enjoyed it. I just really enjoyed the fact that it was just this conversation that you can have with, hundreds of thousands of people without even knowing that they're there. You're sitting in a room. I'm looking at you and looking at Duncan, but you're a lot of the time you're on your own in a dark room. You don't really know if anyone's listening, and you kind of, but you can feel them.
And one thing I've noticed about doing radio versus television, as well as listening to radio and watching television, is there is something a lot more intimate about when it's just audio only. If you're listening to a radio program, you're listening to people speaking. There is something more intimate, bizarrely, something where you feel more connected to them than if you're looking on the TV, which I've always found interesting.
Yeah, I think so. And of course, now we've got this kind of what you might call a sort of hybrid version of that, because people still do listen on the radio. People still listen to radio in their car, because obviously they can't watch it, but they're watching it now as well.
Yeah.
almost like it's radio on TV. It's not really TV, which I think is the strength of it, really, because TV is vacuous and full of idiots and full of sycophants and hypocrites. And radio,
but you can argue that certain bits of radio are as well. I mean, if you look at some of the competitive, I use the term talk stations very loosely. I mean, let's talk about LBC. I mean, that is remarkably smug these days. It's condescending. And what talk does well, and what talk sport has also done well in the past, is it's simply real, right? It is how normal people talk down the boozer.
Exactly right. And I think, and we don't talk down to people.
No.
We let them feel as if whatever they have to say is important. And one of the things that we do now, which is a new thing, is the voice note, which is incredibly powerful, because a lot of people who might not think about phoning in because they'd be nervous or they'd be worried they'd say the wrong thing, they can record something, send it in, and we can play it out, and I don't even interrupt them, which is what I would normally do. So that's a real kind of nice new intimacy sort of vehicle, if you like, where people can just make, and some of the stuff we get is so funny. I mean, you've got people that are real comedians out there in the big wide world who are just ordinary people with ordinary jobs, but who can't stand what's going on with this government, can't stand what's happening to Britain, and they're funny about it. It's quite incredible.
I've heard some great voice notes on your morning show. People actually making up poems or singing songs about stuff. It's superb.
It really is. It's a whole new kind of art form, really, and we use it, I think, more than anybody else, even on our station. And I haven't really heard any other people doing it. No. So it's a new thing that we feel as if we sort of pioneered it.
And it is. I mean, having conversations with the real public is valuable. I mean, we, the Taxpayers Alliance, we're one of the few campaign groups in Westminster that do essentially grassroots action days. Where, our Town Hall Rich List in particular were famous, and we'll take our Town Hall Rich List roadshow around the country to places with the highest paid council bosses and that sort of thing, and we'll just have conversations with ordinary people. And you're right, sometimes they can be a little uncomfortable because they're expressing some unusual views, but it does teach you how to engage with normal members of the public, people from all backgrounds with all different political views, and how to try and maintain a polite, cordial, but nevertheless robust conversation, and it is vital.
And it's very sort of explosive when you have, say, an MP or somebody to come in and listen to what the callers have got to say. Because I mean, despite what they may say that they have their own meetings with people and they have their own kind of community groups and all of that, they're never prepared for it. So I don't think they really do it, or at least they must maybe somehow put their list of people who are going to talk to them through some kind of sieve of some kind, because they're always quite shocked at what people think of them and what they think of their policies.
I tell you what I love about your Morning Glory show on Talk is that it's very clear. If you listen to it in a slightly different way, as someone who works in broadcasting and radio and stuff, it's really clear to me that the people who contact you genuinely appreciate the fact that there's a platform that you're providing for them, and they don't get that on other stations because there is that filtering process, and there is this kind of like, we can't put that caller on there because we're a little bit too full on or whatever. As you pointed out with the voice notes, you'll run those voice notes, you'll play those voice notes, and some of the opinions are quite hardcore, and that's fine because that's what good talk radio is about. But it's just so clear to me that people really welcome that platform.
Yeah, I think so, because as you say, there are so few places where their voices are heard, and it's important for them as much as it is for us that their voices are heard, because otherwise you feel as if you're just kind of a bit of flotsam and jetsam walking around, paying your taxes, getting hit up for some more council tax, finding that they're not emptying your bin, and some of the stuff which they some people would joke about it and say, here we go again, talking about bin collection. People care about bin collection. Because if somebody doesn't take your bin away, it creates a mess. It creates a nest of foxes and vermin and all the rest of it. And people, do really give a stuff about it, and it's an important part of their lives in the same way that they care about MPs wasting public money, that they care about the Speaker of the House flying around the world charging us $250,000.
Why does he keep going to Gibraltar, Mike? What's that about?
Do you see, I've been asking this question a lot, and apparently my first theory was he's got some kind of woman there,
surely not,
or bloke or something. But apparently he's taken his wife there as well. So, unless it's really complicated.
That doesn't mean anything in this day and
because
age.
one of the things is that he didn't have an address or a hotel where he stayed in Gibraltar. He just said, address not provided. And you just think, well, that's a bit weird, because he's admitted staying in the Shangri-La in Singapore.
4 seasons in
Oman. 4 seasons in Oman. Some, ritzy, I think it was a
Ritz-Carlton in LA.
It was a Western resort in Grand Cayman. I think it was Ritz-Carlton in LA. I mean, top-notch hotels all over the place. Suddenly Gibraltar, nothing. and maybe he didn't find a hotel that was expensive enough. I don't know.
Yeah.
But people care about that stuff because they see hypocrisy. They know how much the tax is going out of their salary every single month, and it just keeps going up.
Yeah.
And they're sick of it.
Let's talk a bit about journalism in more detail, because before radio, I mean, you're at proper Fleet Street. I use the word legends because I've heard some of the stories, and I think they do fall into the category of legendary. Daily Express, you work for?
Daily Express, yeah, I pretty much work for everybody, really.
Yeah.
Daily Express, Daily Mirror, Sunday Times, Today. I was a foreign correspondent in New York. I kind of broke into Fleet Street kind of by the back door, really, because I never actually did a journalism degree or anything like that. I basically got into it by ringing up Kelvin McKenzie one morning at 8:30 and saying I wanted a job. And he's like, "We've managed to get hold of me, so we'll give you a go."
Yeah.
And it's
Good lesson for any students listening, or anyone listening who wants to be a hack. There you go.
Yeah. And yeah, it was the old days of sort of kicking the doors in and doing whatever you wanted, and it was amazing. And I moved to New York when I was 23, and worked there for sort of 10 years and set up my own business as a freelance, basically. But I sort of worked for all the different papers, and it was very valuable time to be in New York, because all of the newspapers in those days still had bureaus.
Yeah.
They had I think the Mail had 5 people there, the Mirror had 4, the Sun had a couple. The Sunday Times had an entire bureau. The Daily Telegraph had about 5 people. There was loads of British journalists around, because in those days, I try and explain this to my kids, before the internet, you actually had to go places. You actually had to, physically get on a plane and find somebody that lived in the middle of, Arkansas, and knock on their door and ask them a question. And there wasn't really any other way to do it. You couldn't just find the phone number. You couldn't just, send them an email or send them a text. You had to literally turn up on the doorstep. Hence the phrase doorstepping people. And it was fabulous. It was just fantastic. It was my first job when I was there, working for a local a national magazine, when they said, "We want you to go to Florida," and I was like, crikey, how am I going to get to Florida? I didn't have any money, I didn't have really a car, I didn't have any kind of means of supporting myself. And then they just came and gave me a bucket load of money, gave me a car voucher, and they said, "We booked you into this hotel." I was like, "This is great.
Yeah.
This is amazing, that was kind of where it started. And then I came back to Britain in sort of 1992, I guess it was. And got stuck into it for another 10 years before I left. And so parts of some big stories, Princess Diana dying, Tony Blair getting elected, all of that stuff, I was right front and centre of that, and it's the most fabulous business I've ever been in.
Let's talk a bit about the older days of journalism, right?
Yeah.
Because you've described it there brilliantly. Having to explain to your kids this is life before the internet. So you'd be working on a story, but you'd have to use your initiative, right? And you'd have to find people, track people down, and get the story. If you compare to where we are now in 2025 in the state of journalism, where I know hacks who never leave the office. No. I know hacks whose idea of journalism is just rewriting a press release. They don't go out and talk to anyone. They don't talk to normal
people. Or just
people.
looking up people on Wikipedia.
Exactly.
I found out the Mirror. I was horrified. I was like, that's not a source. Wikipedia is not a source. No. It's not. You don't even know if everything's in there.
Because we can go on there in a second and change someone's entry, can't we?
And you talk about journalists that don't leave the office. I think there is actually a lot you can do if you just sat in the office, right? Which maybe not enough of them do, which is there is just a vast amount of government data that is now published. A number of council transparency documents, annual accounts is absolutely vast. And, I always wonder how many of them have this sort of get up and go attitude to actually start poring over this stuff, because there's always stories in there, stories about wasting taxpayers' money and the like.
Yeah. But again, I think the whole idea of actually physically going out and meeting people and getting contacts will actually will sort of broaden your horizons, and it gives you that feel of wanting to find out more information. Whereas, like Duncan says, there's a lot of people who just they're happy with the information they're given, as opposed to what actually is behind that. It might be that you can get hold of a great set of data and you can make a good story out of it. But if you actually go and find the person that's collected it, or you go and talk to them about it, you'll actually get even more. And you won't just get what everybody else has got. And that's kind of, there was a great amount of rivalry back in the day in Fleet Street. It was important that you got the story first. And if somebody else got the story before you used to get a terrible shellacking from the news desk or from the editor going, what the hell do you think you're doing? Why have we had to copy this story out of the paper that we didn't have it? And so there was competition, which seems to have disappeared now. You don't get the sense that people are fighting over stories anymore.
No. Where do you think we are with political journalism in the 21st century? Yeah,
I think it's really awful.
Because it seems to me we're in a position now where it's all about having access, right?
Yeah.
So you want to go on the plane with Keir Starmer somewhere.
Yeah.
So what you don't do is you don't run a story about Keir Starmer that you know is absolutely dynamite, because then you won't get the access in the future. And I think that has really taken political journalism to an all-time low.
It has, and I think a lot of the reason for that is the way that the kind of special advisor kind of cult has grown up as well, where you've got the press effectively being harnessed by people who run PR for ministers and for Downing Street, and you have to have the access. But in the old days, it was always a bit of that, because you'd have specialists, as we used to call them, which I was never one of. You'd have a defence specialist, you'd have an environment specialist, you'd have then you'd have the sports reporters, and they all knew stories that they never wrote because they didn't want to upset their sources. And so whenever anything happened, like with a footballer who was a miscreant and got caught, with somebody else's wife or whatever, or some other scandal, the sports guys would always go, "Oh yeah, we knew about that," and you go, "Well, why is it not in the paper then?" But they didn't do it because, he's a good bloke, he's a good mate of mine. And so the same goes for politics, I think, where people develop friendships. And I don't think as a journalist you should have really too many friendships. You could be friends with people, but it shouldn't stop you burning them if they do something wrong.
Yeah, not
and
in
that's
the
kind
industry,
of my attitude to it. At the moment with Reform and everything, I'm quite good friends with some of the guys in Reform. And, it doesn't stop me doing the story that they might be blowing themselves up over everything that's going on. And I wouldn't ever change my view based on the fact that, I happen to know them.
Yeah, let's get back to Reform in a second, because I know a lot of our podcast listeners will be interested in your views on the current state of affairs with Reform. But let's just stick with the political journalism stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I find it quite interesting that, there's almost a fine line that's developed now with some journalists who, if you squint or mishear something, you could almost imagine they're just simply activists for a political party.
Well, look at how many of them become actual members of those political parties.
Yeah.
I mean, quite often now you'll get a Downing Street press aide having been hired from, if it's Labour, the Mirror, or if it's Conservative, the Times or the Sun or the Telegraph. There's a sort of class of journalists now who kind of float between the two places.
Yeah.
And if they then leave their job as a journalist, they become lobbyists. I mean, they're more political really than I was basically what they would call a sort of old-fashioned news guy. So I would just cover everything. And I didn't have any particular axe to grind. I didn't really have any ambition to be in Downing Street. I didn't want to be part of that world, and so I wasn't always angling for it. And so if they offered me the job, I'd just go, well, why would I do that? I don't want to do that. I mean, Alistair Campbell, I guess the ultimate example.
Yeah.
He was the Daily Mirror's political editor. And look at him now, he trots around the world interviewing terrorists.
And it means
with
you
Rory
wonder...
Stewart and thinks it's a good thing.
I mean, you can look at some of the recent scandals and where they've been uncovered. So I think the big post office scandal, I think that was covered by a trade publication. I think it was Technology, Computer Magazine.
That's right.
I think some of the HS2 scandals have been identified by Transport. Publications and magazines, so credit to them. But this is stuff that should, political journalists should be finding out. And
they should.
So much of the waste stories come from the Taxpayers Alliance at the moment, and that's great. But it would be nice, and we are seeing it a little bit more since Elon Musk came into the White House. This stuff should be covered. It should be bread and butter for a lot of the media.
But one of the other things that happened, of course, was that during the time when I was still in Fleet Street, was Tony Blair created this whole Freedom of Information Act thing, which is a complete and utter, fallacy, because they simply created a way of them not giving you any information. I remember when I was working in Scotland, and we used to put in FOIs all the time to the Scottish Parliament, and they'd either come back with, that's going to be too expensive for us to do, or you're going to have to narrow that down into one question rather than three, we can't do, and it gave them a kind of structural framework within which they could deny us the information.
Elliot, what's that story you keep telling me about when you asked the BBC about, so you put in certain FOIs to the BBC, and what's that fudge they always come back with?
So the BBC have a formal exemption under the FOI Act, so any information that they hold for journalism, art or literature, they don't have to disclose. So if you ask them how much they've spent on loo roll, over the last 3 years, they have to tell you that. But if you ask them, for example, how much have you paid to an Afghan the Afghan national broadcaster, which is effectively the state arm of the Taliban, propaganda arm of the Taliban. How much have you paid them to ensure that you can keep broadcasting in the country? They can say, well, that's information held for the purposes of journalism.
Right.
So I find the BBC exemption a particularly dodgy one. I think generally the FOI Act has probably been for the good. But yeah, listen, there are so many parts of this state, and you're right, the Scottish government are particularly bad.
Well, we
will look for any reason.
Yeah, I mean, we
to
know
block
talk that we put a lot of questions into mostly the Home Office.
And
to try and get, and they're not very good at all at delineating anything. Like they'll give you a global figure of something or other. Oops, sorry. They'll give you a global figure of something or other, but what they won't do is break it down by nationality. If you ask about crime statistics or anything like that,
and I think the problem is they deliberately choose not to hold that data because they know that if they do hold the data. It's not going to let
or they deliberately withhold it and sort of give you a fudged answer and say, well, we don't have it broken down any other way.
What are your thoughts on the BBC, Mike?
Kill it. Just shoot it dead now, really. I mean, it's a completely pointless exercise.
As someone who grew up as a lad listening to Radio 4, you want to kill the BBC.
Well, it used to be great. I mean, I used to listen to the day programme even as recently as the early sort of noughties, the early 2000s. Yeah, I mean, when was it that it started to go wrong? I would say even back in the days when I was in the Daily Express, it was in the 90s, you had to listen to the day programme on the way into work to know what the big stories of the day were. But you don't anymore because it's not like that anymore. And I think it was when I was in Scotland, which was sort of 2002-ish, I started moving across to 5 Live because I just thought, the Today programme has just become so... Didn't even know... I don't think I knew the word woke back then.
No.
But it had become this kind of very middle class, very kind of clingy, rather wet operation. And as much as I never really liked John Humphreys, at least he used to ask some pretty decent questions. Yeah. He was a bit sanctimonious old sod, by the way. But I mean, he was so much better than who they've got now. And I just think now there's too many of them. They make a big deal of it. They try and pretend that they're this, amazing, interpreter of what's going on in the world, when in fact they don't even know how biased they are.
And
they just don't see it.
Isn't it funny when people leave the BBC and go elsewhere, predominantly into the commercial broadcasting sector? What do we discover? We discover their true opinions and allegiances. So John Sopel, Emily Matis, Lewis Goodall,
absolutely
all of these, Sheila Fogarty, Andy Marr, right?
And they're not very good either. That's the other thing. Without their sort of phalanx of producers, they're not actually that good.
Yeah.
And look at people like Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, who are now apparently very successful podcasters. They just get everything wrong. Yeah. And you kind of go, who's listening to this rubbish? Yeah. And there's apparently a lot of people who do.
Centrist dads, Mike. That's what we call them on this podcast.
Yeah, Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, they had that big photo shoot, didn't they, with the new leader of Syria?
Yeah, the terrorist.
And there's now fairly serious, incredible reports about the slaughter of ethnic minorities, religious minorities in Syria. So, I mean, that judgment they made and that collapsed within months.
And I think that's another thing that's happened is you've got this kind of class of, podcasters who now do what they think, I presume, is political journalism. But it really isn't. It's kind of ill-informed, debate or discussion. It's not really based on any facts. I actually watched a clip from the news agents the other day. And Emily Matis was going on about how somebody had told her something about what the Russian endgame was and what the American endgame was. And she said, I know it sounds completely ridiculous and it's probably not true, but she then spent another 5 minutes explaining what it was. And you're kind of going, what? Sorry, what is this? So you're supposed to be employed to be somebody with a brain who's got the ability to kind of take information in and interpret it. You're not supposed to just tell people what you think might not be true.
Yeah.
Right? And on the basis that that's all you've got today,
Never trust a grown-up woman who's got a Snoopy sticker on her laptop. That's the Emily Matis takeaway.
That's a very good rule.
Let's just go back to Reform UK. It's the political story of the last few days, and the usual rules apply here. We record this podcast on a Tuesday. It goes live Thursday afternoon, so things could change. I think most of our listeners will be fully aware, but a very public spat between Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe. What have your listeners been saying about this, Mike?
They've been surprisingly anti-Farage, actually, which has taken me slightly by surprise because... when this story broke sort of back end of last week, I was saying, whatever happens here, I think Rupert Lowe is probably not going to survive in Reform. So it's certainly starting to look that way, that he's not going to be any longer a Reform MP. At some point, they'll cut the cord. But he's not going anywhere, so he'll be an independent MP, presumably. Some people think he might become a Tory. But at the end of the sort of first week, if you like, it looked as though, so Farage will just, kind of tough it out. He'll be another dissenter that sort of left the mothership, as it were. But I think this time it's a bit more important than that, because this time there's a lot of people saying Farage is bad for the party. He's actually wrong to be the leader. He can't handle people being, critical of him. He can't handle any dissent of any kind. And if he can't run 5 MPs, including himself, then what's he going to be able to do if they get more? And how is he going to run a government if that's where he wants to end up?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, the British right has been lacking in leaders. It's been lacking in great minds. It's been lacking in the sorts of force of nature that we need in order to transform the country in all the various ways that we can discuss. And listen, I don't know what's going on between Rupert and Nigel as people, but listen, they're clearly both formidable politicians with a huge amount to offer to the British political right, and for them to fall out so publicly, I think it does concern me, because this country cannot afford to have years and years and years of vapid, tepid, centrist government. We do need a solidly right-leaning government that will transform the country, and so it's really genuinely is quite concerning. I think.
Well, because if reform doesn't survive, and I think there's a chance that it won't. I'm not saying that it can't kind of recover, but at the moment it looks pretty bleak for them, because without Rupert Lowe, who is one of their sort of formidable MPs, I guess, more than perhaps any of the others, they've already dropped down to sort of 50% of their activity, if you like, because he was constantly asking questions to government, that kind of thing. I mean, he was very much a good person to put out there for donors. He's not in it for the money. He doesn't need it. I mean, he's been saying, I saw the interview he did with Dan Wootton, where he talked about, he's 67 years old, his wife's not that happy that he's still working, and she'd rather he probably
we had him in on one of these episodes.
Okay.
And it was a great conversation, wasn't it?
Really
Self-made man,
no
successful businessman.
And there's no question that he's a capable individual. There's no suggestion from what I've seen that he's suffering from anything physical or mental, that he has any dementia related issues. And as I said today, his own staff put out a statement in which they said, we're very happy to work for him. He's not a bully. He's never given us any trouble. He treats us all with great respect. In fact, he's a great boss. And so you kind of go, all right, so what's this really all about then?
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, someone said to me over the weekend that the outside of the world that we inhabit, which is like a bit of the Westminster stuff, but also the media world, that actually not many people know who Rupert Lowe is. No. The main face and voice of reform is Farage, right? Yeah. And it always will be. So they were taking the view that, this is a bump in the road, but ultimately it won't do reform a great deal of damage, because, some bloke who's, a reform supporter, or someone who voted reform, in Doncaster or whatever, probably isn't that clued up about Rupert Lowe. Is that a fair comment?
I think it probably is a fair comment, but listen, it's a long time till the next election, and the thing that keeps parties going is enthusiasm. And the enthusiasm comes from the most committed members, the people that are going to do the leafleting, that are going to knock on doors, the people that are going to donate money to the party. So for the broader base of reform voters, the potential pool that they're fishing in, I think probably they may not be that aware of Rupert Lowe, and it doesn't matter. But for that core that they need to keep driving the party, if a big chunk of them are really big fans of Rupert Lowe, which it does seem to be, and you start to lose that enthusiasm, I think that could have ramifications.
So actually the people who do the leafleting and stuff like that will know who Rupert Lowe is, and actually might just go, do you know what, this is not good, I'm not going to help.
And it's not the first time this has happened. People are dredging up all sorts of names, from the past, even going back to Robert Kilroy-Silk, who I'd completely forgotten about. Suzanne Evans, Patrick, what's his face?
Patrick O'Flynn. Douglas Carswell. I've seen do stuff. Ben Habib, Howard Cox.
And it means that instead of, Reform haven't yet announced a particularly detailed policy platform, but when they do, instead of talking about their policy platform and what they intend for the country, people are going to be spending a lot of time talking about infighting and spats, and that's going to be really damaging.
And also the thing that I think is also damaging the brand is the way that they're behaving, in the way that, Lee Anderson is writing letters as if he's a sort of sergeant at arms, as if he's in charge of the moral compass of the party, which, doesn't really have much of a moral compass. I don't really care about moral compasses, but, they certainly shouldn't be calling the police about something that somebody said. It just doesn't sound like something Reform should be doing. In the same way they shouldn't be stunting up complaints which are made about other people and making out they're about Rupert Lowe, because they're not.
Or the
And
police
which could be
stuff.
vexatious as well.
Right.
Yeah.
The police stuff's really interesting because you strip it down. There's a guy in his mid to late 30s, the chairman of Reform, who's effectively gone to the police and said there's this geezer who's 67, and he said something nasty to me, which is absurd, isn't it?
And there's this slit your throat quote which Rupert Lowe has denied saying about him. He said, basically the party's slitting its own throat. Even if he did say he would slit somebody's throat, I mean, it's part of the badinage of politics, as he says. We've had robust conversations before. What the hell are they doing calling the police? It doesn't sound right.
And I thought Reform was about moving away from that culture where we become obsessed with every word that.
Well, again, it weakens.
said.
With every sort of move away from what your core values are supposed to be, it weakens your position. The next time Nigel Farage decides to get up in Parliament and criticise some government department for being woke
or going after Alison Pearson,
they're going to say, well, what about you? What did you do?
Exactly right. Let's spend the last few minutes of this episode, and it's been great so far, so thank you, Mike, because Elliot came up with this great idea about if Mike Graham was Prime Minister, what would the country look like?
Well, so I mean, let's say you had a month, because people say a day in Downing Street, it's like by the time you made a cup of tea, there's not much of the day left. So if you had a full month, I want to know what would be the
without wishing to upset Liz Truss, obviously. I'd hope not to wreck the economy inside of 4 weeks, obviously. I'd definitely scrap everything net zero had to offer and take all taxes off petrol cars and put them all on electric cars instead. Do it the other way around. And basically certainly do away with an awful lot of the anti-car lobby type punishments, speeding fines, parking fines, all of that. And the easiest thing, of course, is start actually properly deporting people who are criminals. I'm not even going to go down the mad what they would call massively right-wing point of just embarking on mass deportations. But what I would do is take everybody out of the prison system who happens to be foreign and send them the hell home to wherever it is they come from. And start arresting people on the beach as they arrive and say, you're illegal, as the Trump administration is saying. If you enter my country illegally, you're a criminal. And we're going to put you in a van and we're going to drive you back across the channel and we're going to drop you in France. And it's as simple as that, really. I mean, that would be probably the first day.
I don't think
the first day. So you got
no
29 days
disagreement.
left.
Well, I'm a great believer in just getting things done quickly. I mean, look at what Donald Trump's done. Executive order 1 to 100. Just keep signing them. So by the end of the first week, you've actually stopped an awful lot of the things in their tracks that are, completely and utterly easy to stop.
Yeah.
I don't think there's going to be any disagreements from many of our listeners to this podcast. I mean, you mentioned Trump. Just give us a thumbnail sketch in your assessment of him so far, and also regarding how he's attempting to deal with Ukraine.
Well, I think he started off brilliantly, and his first month was an absolute kind of lesson in efficiency and how to get things done. People tell me now in America that there's a lot of challenges coming through the legal system, so some of the stuff that he's announced that he's doing might take a bit longer than it looked like in the first instance. I think he's borderline touching, sort of dancing with the devil on the whole Ukraine deal. I think he did the right thing to bring Zelensky to the table, did the right thing to get the Russians to talk to him as well. Where it goes from here, though, I think he has to be really careful because he's also now messing with the economy. A lot of his sort of threats about tariffs are bringing share prices down. There's a bit of panic in the markets. And while I'm not a fan of, bowing down to the markets and anything like that, I think he has to just maybe take it easy, slow down a bit, make sure he gets the things done that he wants to get done. Definitely gets peace in Ukraine by whatever method. I think anybody sensible understands that, Ukraine are going to have to give up some of their land, even if it means, giving in to Putin a little bit. It's got to be done. And the same goes for Gaza. I think he can find peace there, and I think he's done a fantastic job. And he's got a good team of people behind him. He's much better this time around than he was in 2016, where I think he was all about kind of punishing people for being so horrible to him. Yeah. Whereas now he's a bit more statesman-like. He knows he doesn't get a second or third term. And so, but I just think he could probably do with a couple more people around him who might occasionally suggest that he's gone a bit mad and maybe he should row it in a bit.
Yeah, I think it's his key point that he is a disruptor, and I think in a huge number of policy areas, both in the United States and here, we do need disruption. We do need things to be shaken up. But it's about making sure that there's a reason for it, there's a purpose for it. You're not just doing it for the sake of it. And I think, with some Trump things, there is a slight risk that
there is a bit.
He's shaking it without knowing why he's shaking it.
My point, I suppose, is you can't spend the whole 4 years doing that.
Exactly, yeah.
Great to do it at the beginning, but now it's time to kind of flatten it down a bit and quieten everybody down a bit and just get on with the business of business.
Yeah.
Final political question. Kemi Badenoch, is she still going to be leader in time for the next election,
I
do you
don't
reckon?
think so.
No?
I don't think she's doing very well. I mean, I actually interviewed both her and Jenrick before the decision was made, and I thought she would be the better choice. But I think I got that wrong, because it turns out that Jenrick actually, since she's become leader, has been a lot more substantial, really, than she has. And I'm quite surprised at how bad she is at Prime Minister's questions. I know it's not the end of the world, but it's a performative scenario. But she doesn't seem to have her finger on the pulse. I mean, you talk about how we deal with issues that interest the people and how we reflect the people's views. She doesn't seem to know what they are. She seems a little bit detached for me from ordinary voters. And unless she gets that right soon, I think she's going to be out.
What do you reckon, Elliot?
I think definitely there's a steep learning curve. I think, on the point about Jenrick, I think she gave him a brilliant brief and he's performing very admirably.
Yeah.
And I think probably where you're seeing the best of her is she is allowing some of her star shadow cabinet, people like Andrew Griffith, Robert Jenrick, she is giving them wide latitude to make noise, cause trouble. I think some of her shadow cabinet are there out of a unity point and in order to appease people, and she's going to have to deal with that. But for a long time we've relied too much on the egos of a single leader, and there is some evidence that actually she's a bit better at giving brilliant people the brief that they want and then letting them go for it. And I think that could be a virtue rather than a flaw.
I've been very impressed with Bobby Jenrick's videos on social media. I think they're works of art. I think they're brilliant. Yeah. More, please, Robert.
Yeah, right. I mean, he could have been more, I think, aggressive in his campaign to get the job. And had he been the Jenrick we see now, maybe he would have got it.
Interesting stuff. Listen, gents, we're out of time. Mike, one question, or two questions actually. Come back again in the future?
Certainly.
Thank you, that's great. And people who have been listening to this episode of A Nation of Taxpayers and they want to be clear on where they can hear you and where they can find Talk, just run through the places.
Yeah, it's all over the places. It's on Talk Radio, basically on DAB+. You can find it. If you haven't got DAB+, just get it. It's 2025.
All the cars have it now.
Most cars have it now, exactly right. And if you can't get it, try retuning your radio. YouTube every single day. Got quite a big following there. You can also get it on Alexa and any kind of smart speaker. Also, if you've got a TV that's either an LG or a Samsung, there's an app which you can get. There's also a Talk app as well that you can download from the App Store. So there's a multitude of ways of listening. Unfortunately, we can't put them all together and measure them. If only we could, we'd be kicking LBC's backside.
Yeah. And actually, we're seeing more and more people very quickly with your bumper stickers all over the country.
I know. I mean, thousands of people want a bumper sticker, so we're still printing them basically. And running out of them every sort of couple of days.
Get in contact with Talk, you want a bumper sticker. Listen, Mike, thank you for coming in. Elliot, thank you as always. Just a reminder, you find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify and on YouTube. You can help us by following us and liking us, because that gets the algorithms working and helps us spread the word. And if you want to get in contact and comment on anything you've heard, the email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. I've been your host, Duncan Barkes.